I still remember the way they laughed when I walked into that restaurant wearing a $15 navy dress. Not quietly, no loud enough for me to hear every word. Some people really don't know their place. One woman whispered, glancing straight at me. My daughter-in-law, Brittany, didn't stop them. My son, Ethan, he just looked away. I was already turning toward the door, telling myself I didn't belong there anyway, until the restaurant manager suddenly stepped in front of me, his voice calm but unmistakably respectful. "Mrs. Harper, we've been expecting you." And just like that, the entire room fell silent. If this moment hit close to home, tell me, what would you have done in my place? I'd really love to hear your thoughts. And if you enjoy emotional family stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. Also drop a comment, letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. My name is Zoe Harper. I'm 62 years old, and for most of my life, I believed that love meant giving quietly and expecting nothing in return. For a long time, that belief made me proud of the woman I was. Lately, it's made me question everything. I wasn't always the kind of woman who stood in the corner of a restaurant pretending not to hear people laugh at her dress. Once upon a time, I stood beside my husband Daniel in a life we built together brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice. He was the kind of man who believed in steady work and keeping your word and never showing off what you had. We weren't flashy, but we were secure until the cancer came. It started quietly. Fatigue, a cough that didn't go away, then hospital visits, treatments, bills that arrived faster than we could open them. I watched the man I loved shrink into someone I barely recognized, and I would have sold the roof over our heads if it meant buying him one more year. In the end, I did sell more than I ever thought I would. Not just for him, but for our son. Ethan was in his second year of law school when Daniel passed. I remember standing in the kitchen staring at the pile of unopened envelopes, wondering how I was going to keep everything from falling apart. Tuition wasn't something you could pause. Dreams didn't wait for grief to settle. So I made choices. I sold Daniel's workshop, the place he loved most after our home. I liquidated investments we had spent decades building. I cut corners everywhere else. I learned how to stretch a dollar until it barely held together. And Ethan never had to drop out. He graduated on time, he passed the bar, he got the job. Every time someone told him how impressive he was, I smiled and nodded like I had nothing to do with it. Because I didn't want him to carry guilt. I wanted him to carry confidence. For a while, it felt like it was all worth it. Then Brittany came into his life. At first, I told myself she was just different, more polished, more concerned with appearances. She had a way of walking into a room like she was already being admired, like she expected the world to reflect her, back in perfect lighting. I tried to like her. I really did. But there was always something in the way she looked at me, like I was something she had to tolerate, not someone she respected. Zoe's very simple. I once heard her tell a friend, thinking I was out of earshot. Simple. It wasn't the worst word someone could use, but the way she said it made it feel like an insult wrapped in a smile. Ethan didn't correct her. That was the first time I felt something shift. It wasn't immediate. It never is. It happened slowly, like a crack forming in glass. Small at first, easy to ignore, until one day it's all you can see. Over time, I noticed how Ethan spoke differently when Brittany was around, more careful, more polished. He stopped telling certain stories about our past, the ones that involved hand-me-down furniture or second jobs or the years when we barely got by. He started editing me out of his narrative, and I let him, because I told myself he deserved to feel proud of where he was. I told myself that if shrinking a little made his life easier, then maybe that was just another sacrifice a mother makes. So I kept things simple. I wore what I already owned. I stopped suggesting family dinners at my house. I learned how to sit quietly while Brittany talked about renovations, vacations, and the kind of lifestyle that required more money than I knew they had. And when Ethan would occasionally mention that things were tight, I would quietly help. A bill here. A transfer there. Never anything dramatic, just enough to keep things smooth. He never asked too many questions, and I never volunteered too many answers. What neither of them knew was that I had already been stretching myself thinner than I should have. A few months before that dinner, I had made a decision. There was a woman in my neighborhood, Mary Ann, A widow, not much older than me, who had been slowly losing her home after her husband's debts surfaced. No children to help her, no safety net, just a quiet, dignified woman trying not to fall apart in public. I saw myself in her, and I couldn't look away. So I stepped in, quietly. Covered a few payments, helped her buy time, told myself I would figure out the rest later. That money had to come from somewhere, which is why when Brittany announced her birthday dinner at one of the most expensive restaurants in the city, I stood in front of my closet and realized something simple and uncomfortable. I couldn't afford to impress anyone, not without undoing something I had chosen to protect. So I went to a small clearance store 2 towns over, the kind of place no one in Brittany's circle would ever step foot in. I walked past racks of dresses that tried too hard to look like something they weren't until I found one that didn't pretend. Navy blue, modest cut, comfortable, $15. I remember holding it in my hands and thinking, this is enough. Because it wasn't about the dress. It was about what I refused to sacrifice. What I didn't expect was how much that choice would reveal about the people around me. Standing there in that restaurant, hearing those women laugh, watching Brittany pretend not to notice, seeing Ethan turn his eyes away. It wasn't just embarrassment I felt. It was recognition. Like something I had been avoiding, finally stepped into full light. And even before the manager walked up to me, even before he spoke my name, a quiet, unsettling thought had already begun to take shape in my mind. Maybe I wasn't the one who didn't belong there. Maybe I had just been standing in the wrong place all along. The restaurant was everything Brittany loved, dim lighting that made everything look softer gold accents that caught the glow just right, and tables arranged far enough apart to give the illusion of privacy without ever losing the sense of being seen. It was the kind of place where people didn't just dine, they performed. I noticed it the moment I stepped inside, the way the hostess smiled just a little too brightly, the way the guests at nearby tables glanced up not to greet but to assess. Outfits were scanned, shoes were judged, even posture seemed to carry a kind of quiet competition. And that was before I reached Brittany's table. She had chosen a long rectangular arrangement in the center of the room, as if she wanted to make sure there was no corner where attention might drift away from her. Candles flickered between crystal glasses. A floral arrangement stretched across the table, elaborate enough to block half the view. Brittany was seated at the head, of course. She wore a fitted ivory dress that probably cost more than my monthly expenses. Her hair fell in perfect waves over one shoulder, and when she laughed, she tilted her head just slightly like she had practiced the angle. "Zoe," she said, when she saw me, her smile widening just enough to be polite but not warm. "You made it." I nodded, forcing a small smile. "Of course." "Happy birthday." Her eyes flickered briefly over my dress. It wasn't a long look, but it was enough. "Oh, that's nice." She added, her tone light but hollow, as if she had reached for the safest compliment she could find and still come up short. Ethan stood beside her, one hand resting casually on the back of her chair. He glanced at me, then at the table, then back at me again. "Hey, Mom," he said. Just that, sat. No hug, no warmth, no acknowledgement of the effort it had taken for me to show up at all. "Hi, sweetheart," I replied, my voice softer than I intended. Brittany gestured toward the far end of the table. "We saved you a seat." Saved. I walked toward it, slowly becoming more aware of the eyes following me with every step. Conversations didn't stop, but they shifted, lowered slightly, tilted in my direction. The seat was exactly where I expected it to be. Not beside Ethan, not near Brittany, but at the edge of the table, close enough to be included, far enough to be forgotten. I sat down, carefully smoothing my dress over my knees. The fabric felt thinner under my fingers than it had in the store. Across from me, 3 women leaned slightly toward each other, their voices dipping into that familiar half-whisper people use when they want to be heard just enough. "Is that his mother?" one of them murmured. "I think so." Another replied, her lips barely moving. "I thought she'd be different." A pause, then a quiet, amused exhale. Well, the first woman said, "I guess not everyone upgrades." The third woman didn't say anything. She just looked at me directly this time and raised her glass in a small, almost mocking acknowledgement. I felt the heat rise in my chest before I could stop it. Not anger, exactly. Something sharper, something closer to humiliation but steadier, controlled. I looked down at the menu, though I already knew I wouldn't be ordering much. The prices were printed in a delicate font, but the numbers were impossible to ignore. Ethan leaned slightly toward Brittany, speaking low enough that he probably thought I couldn't hear. "Did you tell them she was coming?" he asked. Brittany's smile didn't falter. "I mentioned it," she said lightly. "I just didn't think it would matter." Matter. The word lingered in the air longer than it should have. Dinner moved forward in small, polished motions. Orders were placed, wine was poured. Laughter rose and fell like background music, and through it all, Brittany told stories. Not about herself, about Ethan. "Oh, he worked so hard to get where he is," she said, at one point her voice carrying just enough to reach the entire table. No shortcuts, no handouts, just pure determination. A few people nodded appreciatively. "That's rare these days," someone added. "Very rare," Brittany agreed, glancing at Ethan with admiration. I felt something inside me tighten. Not because she praised him, but because she rewrote the truth so easily. Ethan didn't correct her. He smiled. I kept my eyes on my glass. There was a moment, just a small one, when he could have said something. Anything. He didn't. "And we're finally starting to build the life we deserve," Brittany continued. "The house, the travel, everything. It's been a long time coming." Another round of approving murmurs. Someone asked, "Didn't your family help at all in the beginning?" Brittany laughed softly, shaking her head. "Not really. Ethan's always been independent. I pressed my fingers lightly against the edge of the table, grounding myself in the cool surface beneath them. Across from me, the same woman who had spoken earlier tilted her head slightly. "That explains a lot," she said, her tone carrying a subtle edge. I looked up just in time to see her eyes flick toward my dress, then back to Brittany. Brittany didn't stop her, didn't redirect, didn't even pretend to misunderstand. She simply took a sip of her wine and let the implication settle where it would. And that was the moment something inside me shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet certainty that I could no longer ignore. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't oversight. This was positioning, carefully, deliberately, and consistently. I wasn't just being overlooked. I was being minimized, reduced to a version of myself that made their story cleaner, simpler, more impressive. A mother who had always been small, so they could appear bigger. I inhaled slowly, lifting my glass to my lips, though I didn't drink. The room felt different now, not because anything had changed, but because I was finally seeing it clearly. Every glance, every word, every silence, it all fit together in a way I hadn't allowed myself to recognize before. I set the glass down gently, and for the first time that night, I stopped trying to make myself smaller. That was when I noticed movement at the edge of the room. The manager, Lucas. He had been watching for a while, I realized that now. Not in a way that drew attention, but with the kind of quiet awareness that comes from someone who understands more than he says. Our eyes met briefly. Something in his expression shifted. Recognition. Concern. Then something else. Decision. He adjusted his jacket and began walking toward our table, his steps steady, unhurried, but purposeful enough to draw attention. Conversations didn't stop immediately, but they softened. Guests noticed. Staff noticed, and as he approached, even Brittany's smile flickered with curiosity. Lucas stopped beside me. Not beside Brittany, not beside Ethan, beside me. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then in a voice calm enough to carry but controlled enough to command the room without raising it, he said, "Mrs. Harper, we've been expecting you." And just like that, the entire story Brittany had been building began to crack. For a moment, no one moved. It was as if the entire room had paused mid-breath, waiting to understand something that didn't quite make sense. Brittany blinked first. "I'm sorry," she said, with a polite laugh glancing between Lucas and me. "I think there might be a mistake." Lucas didn't look at her. His attention remained on me, steady and respectful, like he was waiting for my permission to continue. And that alone shifted something in the air, because people notice where respect is directed. And right now, it wasn't directed at the woman in the ivory dress at the head of the table. It was directed at me. I felt every pair of eyes in the room turn not just curious now, but alert, careful. I could have corrected him, Could have laughed it off, said he must have confused me with someone else. That would have been the easier path, the quieter one. But something in me, something that had been pushed aside for far too long, didn't want quiet anymore. Not tonight. I lifted my chin slightly and met Lucas's gaze. "Good evening, Lucas," I said. I watched the reaction ripple across the table. Brittany's smile tightened. Ethan's brows pulled together, confusion settling in where indifference had been just moments before. "You know each other?" Brittany asked, her tone still light but strained now like a thread pulled too far. Lucas finally turned his head toward her, offering a polite nod. "Yes," he said simply. "Mrs. Harper and her late husband have been very important to this establishment." Important. The word landed heavier than I expected. I saw one of Brittany's friends straighten in her chair. Another leaned slightly forward, suddenly more interested in me than in her wine. Brittany let out a small, controlled laugh. "Oh, that's lovely. Zoe never mentioned anything like that. No, I hadn't. Because for most of my life, I didn't believe in announcing what I had done for others. Daniel used to say, if you have to tell people who you are, then you're not showing them, you're convincing them. We never wanted to convince anyone, we just lived." Lucas glanced back at me again, as if asking how much he should say. And for a brief moment, I hesitated. Not because I was ashamed, but because I understood something now that I hadn't before. Once the truth was spoken out loud, it wouldn't just change how they saw me. It would change everything between us. Still, silence had already cost me too much. "You can go ahead," I said quietly. Lucas gave a small nod. Then he stepped slightly closer to the table, his voice calm but clear enough to reach beyond just our group. "Years ago, he began when this building was at risk of being sold off and redeveloped, Mrs. Harper and her husband stepped in. Their investment allowed the restaurant to stay open. Without them, none of this would be here today." A pause settled over the table. Not the awkward kind. The heavy kind. The kind that forces people to rearrange what they thought they understood. Brittany's fingers tightened slightly around her glass. "I wait," she said, her composure slipping just a fraction. "You mean Zoe owns the restaurant?" "No." I answered gently before Lucas could. "Not owns. I didn't want the truth to become another performance. I helped when it mattered," I added. "That's all." Lucas inclined his head slightly. "Mrs. Harper still maintains a small stake in the property," he clarified. "But more importantly, she's someone we've never forgotten." That word again. Important. But this time it didn't feel like something I needed to carry. It simply existed. Across the table, the woman who had mocked me earlier lowered her gaze suddenly, very interested in adjusting her napkin. Another cleared her throat softly. The shift was undeniable. Respect, real or performative, had replaced amusement. And Brittany didn't know where to place herself in it. "Oh," she said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Well, that's impressive. I wish I had known." I studied her for a moment, not with anger, with clarity, because now I could see what had always been there. She didn't respect me. She respected what she thought I could represent, and now that her assumptions had been proven wrong, she was recalculating. Ethan leaned forward slightly. "Mom," he said, his voice quieter now, "why didn't you ever tell me?" That question landed deeper than anything else had that night. I turned to look at him fully, because unlike Brittany, Ethan wasn't recalculating. He was confused, and maybe, just maybe, a little shaken. "I didn't think I needed to," I said. "That's not a small thing." He pressed his tone, uncertain. "You helped save an entire business. I helped someone who needed it," I replied. Lucas smiled faintly at that, because he remembered. He remembered the day he had come to me not as a manager, but as a young man desperate to keep his job after the previous owners announced they were selling. He remembered how Daniel had listened quietly, then looked at me and said, "What do you think?" And how I had said, "If we can help, we should." No contracts at first, no guarantees, just trust. It hadn't been about profit, it had been about people. "I'd like to offer you a different table," Mrs. Harper Lucas said, then gently bringing the moment back to the present, somewhere more comfortable. The offer hung in the air. Everyone understood what it meant. A better table, better placement, better visibility. A silent correction of everything that had happened earlier. I glanced down at the edge seat I had been given, then back at Brittany, at Ethan, at the entire carefully constructed scene that had until a few minutes ago placed me at the very bottom of it. And for the first time that night, I didn't feel small, but I also didn't feel the need to prove anything. "I'm fine here," I said. Lucas studied me for a second, then nodded. "Of course," he said. "If you need anything at all, please let me know." He stepped back, but not before giving me one last look, one that carried both respect and something else. Concern. Because he had seen enough. Probably more than I realized. As he walked away, the room slowly began to breathe again. Conversations resumed, but they were different now, measured, careful. And at our table, the balance had shifted in a way no one could undo. Brittany lifted her glass again, her movements slightly more controlled than before. "Well," she said, forcing brightness back into her tone, "this has been quite the surprise." No one laughed this time. Ethan sat back in his chair, still watching me like he was trying to reconcile two versions of the same person. The one he thought he knew, and the one he had just been introduced to. I picked up my glass again, my fingers steady now, because something inside me had settled, not resolved, but awakened. And as the dinner continued, I realized something that would stay with me long after that night ended. The humiliation I had felt when I walked in, it hadn't come from the dress. It had come from believing, if only for a moment, that I was exactly who they thought I was, and now that illusion was gone. But in its place, a much more dangerous truth had begun to take shape. Because if they had been so comfortable underestimating me, what else had they been comfortable doing? Behind my back. Dinner didn't recover after that. Not really. The candles still flickered. Plates still arrived in perfect timing. Wine still flowed like nothing had shifted. But the illusion, the one Brittany had worked so carefully to construct, had cracked, and everyone could feel it. People spoke more carefully now, laughed a little softer, and every so often someone would glance at me not with amusement anymore, but with curiosity, and something closer to caution. Brittany tried to regain control. I could see it in the way she straightened her shoulders and the way she began steering the conversation again, pulling attention back to herself. So she said brightly, tapping her glass lightly, as I was saying earlier, "We've been looking at expanding our options. Maybe even investing in property soon." One of her friends leaned in. "Oh, that sounds exciting." Brittany smiled. "Yes, we've been exploring a few possibilities. It's really about timing and access." Access. The word lingered. Ethan shifted slightly in his seat, glancing at her, then at me, then back down at the table. He knew something, or at least, he suspected something had been revealed that he hadn't fully understood before. We've actually been talking about taking on something a bit more substantial. Brittany continued, her voice gaining confidence again. "Not just a home, something that builds long-term value." Another friend raised a brow. Like what Brittany hesitated just for a second too long. Then she smiled. "Well," she said, lowering her voice just enough to feel exclusive, "let's just say we might soon have more influence over certain family assets." I didn't move, didn't react, but inside, something tightened. Family assets. That wasn't vague, that wasn't hypothetical, that was deliberate. Across the table, one of the women let out a small, impressed sound. "Wow, that's a big step." Brittany nodded, her confidence returning fully now. "It is, but we're ready for it." Ethan's fingers tapped once against the table, a nervous habit he'd had since he was a boy. He only did it when something felt off. "We've been planning carefully," he added, his tone measured, "making sure everything is structured properly." Structured. Another word that didn't sit right. I took a slow sip of water, giving myself a moment to think. Then, very gently, I set the glass down. "What kind of structure?" I asked. My voice was calm, neutral, but it cut through the conversation more cleanly than anything Brittany had said all night. All eyes turned back to me. Brittany's smile didn't fade, but it tightened. "Oh, just the usual," she said lightly. "Estate planning trusts, making sure things are organized for the future." The future. I held her gaze. "And whose future would that be?" I asked. A flicker. Just a flicker, but I saw it. Brittany laughed softly, waving a hand as if I'd asked something harmless. "Well, ours, of course. Building a foundation, making smart decisions. Ethan cleared his throat slightly. "It's nothing urgent, Mom," he added quickly. "Just long-term planning, long-term planning." The words echoed against something in my memory, something recent, something I hadn't fully examined until now. I leaned back slightly in my chair, letting the conversation move on around me, but I wasn't listening anymore. Not really, because my mind had already begun connecting pieces. Ethan's recent visits, the way he had brought up paperwork casually at first, just standard documents, Mom, he had said one afternoon sitting across from me at my kitchen table. It's better to have things organized early, avoid complications later. I had nodded, trusting him. Of course I had. Why wouldn't I? He was my son. He had explained things in simple terms. Too simple maybe, but I hadn't questioned it. A trust, some updated signatures, nothing that seemed urgent, nothing that seemed dangerous. But now those words sounded different. Structured, control, family assets. I looked up again just in time to see Brittany leaning toward one of her friends, her voice dipping into that same half-whisper from earlier. "It's really just about making sure everything ends up where it belongs," she said. Where it belongs. Something cold moved through me. Not sharp, not sudden, just steady. Because I understood something now that I hadn't allowed myself to consider before. This wasn't about planning. This wasn't about helping. This was about positioning. And I had been standing in the center of it without realizing. "Excuse me," I said quietly, pushing my chair back. No one stopped me. No one asked where I was going. I walked toward the hallway leading to the restrooms. My steps measured my breathing even. But inside, everything was shifting. The hallway was quieter, cooler. The noise of the dining room softened behind me, replaced by the distant clink of dishes and the low hum of voices. I reached the sink and placed my hands on the edge of it, looking at my reflection in the mirror. For a moment, I just stared at the woman in the navy dress, at the lines around her eyes, at the steadiness in her expression. "You missed something," I whispered to myself. Not because I was foolish, but because I had chosen not to see. Because love makes you do that. It fills in gaps. It explains away discomfort. It softens things that should feel sharp, but clarity doesn't ask permission. It arrives when it's ready, and it changes everything. A soft knock sounded behind me. I turned slightly. Lucas stood in the doorway, his expression careful. "I didn't mean to intrude," he said. "I just wanted to check if you were all right." I offered a small nod. "I'm fine." He didn't look convinced. "They've been saying some things," he added gently. "Things that didn't seem right." I held his gaze. What kind of things? Lucas hesitated. Not because he didn't want to speak, but because he understood the weight of what he might confirm. "I've heard them mention ownership," he said finally, implying that they have influence here, that certain arrangements are already in motion. My chest tightened. Arrangements. He nodded slowly. "They asked for special treatment recently, discounts, access to private rooms. They said it wouldn't matter soon because they'd be part of the family side of the business." The words landed heavier than anything I had heard all night. Because they weren't careless. They were confident, too confident. I looked down briefly, then back up. They said that I asked. Lucas's expression didn't change. "Yes." Silence settled between us. Not empty, just full. Full of realization, full of questions I didn't yet have answers to but could no longer ignore. "I thought you should know," he added. I nodded slowly. "I'm glad you told me." He studied me for a moment, then gave a small, respectful nod and stepped back. "I'll be nearby," he said. "If you need anything." Then he was gone. I turned back to the mirror, but this time, I wasn't looking for reassurance. I was looking for truth. And what I saw wasn't a woman who had been humiliated. It wasn't a woman who had been overlooked. It was a woman who had been underestimated by the people who should have known her best. And that realization didn't break me. It steadied me. Because if they believed they could move pieces around me without me noticing, if they believed I would sign whatever they placed in front of me, if they believed I would quietly accept whatever future they had planned, then they didn't know me at all. I dried my hands, slowly smoothing the fabric of my dress as I did. $15. And somehow, It had revealed more truth than anything else I could have worn. As I walked back toward the dining room, I felt it settle fully into place. Not anger, not yet. Something colder, something clearer, awareness, and with it, a question I could no longer ignore. What exactly had my son and his wife already set in motion? When I walked back into the dining room, nothing had changed. And yet everything had. The same candles flickered. The same laughter rose and fell in carefully measured tones. The same polished version of life continued as if it had never been interrupted. But now I could see the cracks. Not in the room, in the people. Brittany was mid-sentence when I returned her hand resting lightly on Ethan's arm as she spoke to the group. "It's really about making smart transitions," she was saying. "You don't want to wait until things become complicated." Complicated. I resumed my seat, quietly folding my hands in my lap. No one acknowledged my absence, not directly, but I noticed the way Brittany's eyes flicked toward me, quick assessing, checking, measuring. Then she smiled again and continued. "It's honestly a relief when older generations are willing to simplify things." She added her tone soft but pointed. "It makes everything smoother for everyone involved." A couple of people nodded. One of the women murmured, "Absolutely. It's responsible. I felt something settle deeper inside me. Not hurt, not anymore. Understanding. Because now I knew. This wasn't just talk. This was groundwork. Narrative. Carefully placed words meant to normalize what they were planning to make it sound reasonable, even admirable. I reached for my water glass, taking a slow sip, letting the silence I carried settle around me. Then I listened. Really listened. "You'd be surprised how many people hold on to things out of sentiment," Brittany continued. "Properties, assets. Even when they're not really using them anymore." A soft laugh followed. "It just slows everything down. Ethan shifted beside her. "Brittany," he said quietly, a hint of discomfort in his voice, but she brushed it off with a smile. "I'm just saying," she replied lightly. "We're trying to be proactive." Proactive. The words stacked on top of each other, now forming something unmistakable. A pattern, a justification, a script they had rehearsed so often it no longer sounded rehearsed at all. Across the table, one of Brittany's friends leaned forward, clearly intrigued. "So what's your plan?" she asked. "Are you helping family reorganize assets or something?" Brittany hesitated just for a fraction of a second. Then she smiled. "Something like that," she said. I looked up, met her eyes, and held them. For the first time that night, she didn't look away immediately. But there was something new there. Not confidence, not superiority, something closer to caution. Because she knew now that I was listening differently. Zoe's always been very... Trusting Brittany added her tone, softening in a way that might have sounded kind to anyone who didn't know better, which is a good thing. It just means she appreciates having guidance. Guidance. There it was. Laid out plainly. I set my glass down carefully. And who would be guiding me, I asked. The question was simple, but it landed like something heavier. Brittany laughed lightly. "Oh, I didn't mean it like that." Ethan leaned forward slightly. "Mom, it's not about control," he said quickly. "It's just about making sure everything is handled efficiently." Efficiently. I studied him, really studied him, the way his jaw tightened just slightly, the way his eyes avoided mine for half a second too long, the way his tone carried reassurance but not honesty. And in that moment, I realized something that hurt more than anything else that night. He wasn't confused. He wasn't being misled. He knew. Maybe not every detail. Maybe not every consequence, but enough. Enough to be part of it. "That sounds like a lot of responsibility," I said calmly. "It is," Brittany replied quickly, stepping in before Ethan could. "But we're prepared for it, prepared." Another word that didn't belong in a casual dinner conversation, unless the conversation wasn't casual at all. A pause followed, not awkward, but shifting, because something unspoken had begun to surface, and everyone at the table could feel it, even if they didn't fully understand it. I leaned back slightly, letting my gaze drift across the room. The restaurant felt different now. Not because of Lucas, not because of what had been revealed, but because I was no longer seeing it through the same lens. Before I had walked in, feeling out of place, small. Now, I felt something else. Stillness, clarity, and beneath it, a quiet, growing resolve. Brittany picked up her glass again, clearly trying to steer the evening back to safer ground. To new beginnings, she said, raising it slightly. A few people echoed the sentiment, lifting their glasses. Ethan hesitated for a fraction of a second, then followed. I didn't. Instead, I watched. Watched the way Brittany smiled just a little too brightly. Watched the way Ethan's hand tightened around his glass. Watched the way their friends exchanged subtle glances, sensing something but not quite naming it. And in that moment, I made a decision. Not a loud one. Not one that required anyone else's acknowledgement, but a decision that would change everything moving forward. I wouldn't confront them tonight. I wouldn't argue. I wouldn't expose anything I had just begun to understand, because they were still talking, still revealing, still underestimating me, and that was something I could use. Dinner continued, but I barely tasted anything that was placed in front of me. Every word, every glance, every small shift in tone, I noticed all of it, collected it, stored it, because for the first time I wasn't reacting. I was observing, learning, and as the evening slowly drew toward its end, I realized something else. This wasn't a sudden betrayal. It hadn't started tonight. It hadn't even started recently. This had been building, quietly, patiently, layer by layer, and I had missed it, because I had trusted them, because I had believed that love, my love, would be enough to keep things honest. But love, I was beginning to understand, doesn't protect you from being used. It only makes it easier. When the bill finally arrived, Brittany didn't reach for it. Of course she didn't. She glanced at Ethan. Ethan hesitated, then reached into his jacket. But before he could take it, Lucas appeared again. "I'll take care of this," he said smoothly. Brittany blinked. "Oh, that's not necessary. It's already been handled," Lucas replied calmly. He didn't elaborate, didn't explain. But he didn't need to, because the message was clear, and the effect was immediate. Brittany's smile faltered. "Just for a second, eh?" Ethan looked at me again, longer this time, as if he was trying to piece something together that no longer fit the way he thought it did. I met his gaze, held it, and for the first time that night, I didn't soften. I didn't reassure. I didn't make it easier for him to look away, because something had changed. Not just in what I knew, but in what I was willing to accept. And as we stood to leave, as chairs scraped softly against the floor and polite goodbyes were exchanged, I understood one thing with absolute clarity. Whatever they had planned, whatever they thought they were preparing me for, they believed they were ahead of me. They believed they were in control. But they had made one mistake, a quiet one, a dangerous one. They had shown me just enough to make sure I would never walk blindly into anything they placed in front of me again. I didn't sleep much that night, not because I was afraid, but because my mind refused to settle. Every word from that dinner replayed itself in fragments: Brittany's careful phrasing, Ethan's hesitation, the way family assets had been spoken, like something already half-claimed. By the time the sun rose, I wasn't confused anymore. I was certain. And certainty changes the way you move. At exactly 9:00 a.m., I walked into the office of Margaret Blake. Margaret had been my attorney for over 20 years. She was the kind of woman who didn't waste time on unnecessary politeness. Tall, composed, with sharp eyes that missed nothing, she had handled everything from our original property investments to Daniel's estate when he passed. If there was anyone I trusted to tell me the truth without softening it, it was her. "Zoe," she said as I stepped in, setting her glasses down and studying my face. "You look like you didn't come here for small talk." "I didn't," I replied. She gestured toward the chair across from her desk. "Sit." I did. For a moment, I just folded my hands together, feeling the weight of what I was about to say settle into place. Then I told her everything. Not dramatically, not emotionally, just clearly. The dinner, the comments, the phrases, the pressure Ethan had been putting on me to simplify my estate, the documents he had brought over, ones I had glanced at but not fully reviewed. Margaret didn't interrupt. She didn't react. She simply listened, her expression growing more focused with every detail. When I finished, the room was quiet. Then she leaned back slightly in her chair. "Do you have the documents?" she asked. I nodded and reached into my bag, sliding the folder across the desk. She opened it immediately, and within seconds, I saw it. That shift, subtle but unmistakable, her eyes sharpened. Her posture straightened. She flipped through the pages more quickly, now her fingers pausing at certain sections, then moving back, reading again. And when she finally looked up at me, there was no softness in her expression. "Zoe," she said carefully, "did you read these?" "Before signing anything, I didn't sign them," I replied. A pause. Then just a fraction, her shoulders relaxed. "Good," she said, just one word, but it carried more weight than anything else she had said so far. I felt my chest tighten slightly. "What is it?" I asked. Margaret closed the folder, slowly placing both hands on top of it. "These are not standard estate documents," she said. The words landed quietly, but heavily. "What do you mean?" I asked. She slid the folder back toward me, tapping lightly on one of the pages. "This section here," she said, "grants financial decision-making authority to your son immediately upon execution." I stared at the paper. The words blurred slightly, then came back into focus. "That's just temporary, right?" I said, though I already knew the answer. Margaret didn't hesitate. "No." Silence filled the space between us. "And this," she continued, turning another page, "gives him authority to manage, sell, or transfer property assets under the condition that it is in your best interest." My fingers curled slightly against the edge of the desk. "In my best interest," I repeated. "A very broad term," Margaret said. "One that can be interpreted in ways that would leave you with very little control." I felt something cold settle in my chest. Not shock, not anymore. Recognition. And here, she added, flipping to the final section, is the most concerning part. She turned the document so I could see it clearly. "This clause establishes a framework for medical and residential decision-making," she said. "If combined with even a minor claim of diminished capacity—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. "They could move me," I said quietly. Margaret met my eyes. "Yes." The word didn't echo. It didn't need to, because it landed exactly where it was meant to. I sat back slowly in my chair, my hands resting in my lap. For a moment I didn't speak, didn't react. I just processed. All the small things, all the moments that hadn't made sense before. Brittany asking about my medications, Ethan casually bringing up how hard it must be to manage things alone, the repeated emphasis on safety, convenience, efficiency. It wasn't concern, it was preparation. "They were setting this up," I said finally. Margaret didn't correct me. "They were preparing for control," she said. A subtle difference, but an important one. "Do you think Ethan understands what this actually does?" I asked. Margaret considered the question, then answered carefully. "He may not understand every legal detail," she said, "but he understands enough to know that it benefits him." That hurt, more than I expected. Not because it was surprising, but because it was final. There was no room left for doubt. No space left for excuses. "What do I do?" I asked. Margaret leaned forward slightly, her tone shifting, becoming more strategic now. "You don't confront them," she said immediately. I nodded. "I wasn't planning to." "Good," she replied, "because right now they believe you're uninformed. That gives you an advantage." Advantage. Another word I hadn't expected to associate with this situation. "You need to stall," she continued. "Appear cooperative. Ask questions, but not too many. Let them think you're considering it. And in the meantime," I asked. "In the meantime," she said, "we protect you." There was something steady in the way she said it. Not dramatic, not reassuring, just certain. "We update your estate plan immediately," she went on. "We put safeguards in place, legal ones that they cannot override. We document everything. Every conversation, every request, every inconsistency." I nodded slowly, absorbing each step. "And if they push?" I asked. "They will," Margaret said, "which is why we let them." I frowned slightly. "Let them?" She gave a small, sharp smile. "People who believe they're in control tend to reveal more than they intend," she said, "especially when they think they're close to getting what they want." A quiet understanding settled over me. This wasn't just about defense, it was about exposure. "You're saying I should give them room to make a mistake," I said. "I'm saying," Margaret replied, "they already have. We just need to make sure it's visible." I exhaled slowly. Not out of fear, but out of something else. relief. Because for the first time since that dinner, I didn't feel alone in this. And Zoe Margaret added her voice, softening just slightly. Whatever you're feeling right now is valid. I met her eyes. Even if it's not just anger, I asked. She shook her head gently, especially if it's not just anger. I nodded. Because what I felt wasn't simple. It wasn't just betrayal. It was grief. Grief for the version of my son I thought I knew. Grief for the trust I had given so freely. Grief for the years I had spent believing that love alone would protect me from something like this. But beneath that grief, something else was beginning to take shape, something steadier, stronger, resolve. I'll do it, I said. Margaret gave a small nod. I know you will. I stood slowly gathering my bag, but I didn't reach for the folder. I didn't need to, because I already knew what was inside it. And more importantly, I knew what it meant. As I walked toward the door, Margaret's voice stopped me. Zoe. I turned. If they had succeeded, she said carefully, you wouldn't have seen it coming until it was too late. I held her gaze, then gave a small, quiet nod. I know. And as I stepped out into the morning light, one thought settled firmly into place. They hadn't just underestimated me. They had almost succeeded because I had underestimated them. But that was over now, because the next move was mine. The hardest part wasn't pretending. It was remembering how to feel natural while doing it. By the time I left Margaret's office, we had already put the first protections in place. New documents were drafted. Old ones were flagged. Instructions were clear. Say nothing. Reveal nothing. Observe everything. So when Ethan called that afternoon, I answered like I always had. Warm, familiar, unaware. Hi, Mom. He said, his tone unusually gentle. How are you feeling today, feeling? The word lingered. I'm all right, I replied. Just a little tired, a small pause. Yeah, he said, I figured last night might have been a lot. That's one way to put it, I said lightly. He exhaled softly as if relieved that I wasn't upset. Listen, he continued. I've been thinking about what we talked about before. The paperwork, there's no rush, but I just want to make sure everything's taken care of properly. You know, so you don't have to worry about anything. There it was again. Worry, responsibility, care, all the right words, placed carefully. I understand, I said. Maybe we can go over it again soon. Another pause. This one longer. Really, he asked. I could hear the surprise in his voice. Yes, I said gently. I think I'd like to understand it better. That was the truth, just not in the way he thought. Of course, he said quickly. We can go through everything step by step. I'd like that, I replied. And just like that, the game began. Over the next few days, I paid attention in a way I never had before. Not to what they said, but to how they said it. Brittany started calling more often. Not long conversations, just small check-ins. Hi, Zoe, just wanted to see how you're doing today. Have you been taking your vitamins? Are you still managing everything okay on your own? Each question sounded harmless, caring. But now I understood what they were really doing. They weren't checking on me. They were building a narrative, one that suggested I needed help, guidance, oversight. I answered every call calmly, consistently, never defensive, never suspicious, just slightly uncertain, enough to give them what they expected. One afternoon, Brittany stopped by unannounced. She stood in my doorway with a bright smile and a box of pastries I knew she hadn't picked out herself. I was in the area, she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. I thought I'd check on you. Of course she did. I led her into the kitchen, watching the way her eyes moved not casually but carefully, taking note of everything. The counters, the mail, the small details that could be turned into something larger later. It looks like you've been keeping busy, she said lightly. I try, I replied. She set the box down and turned toward me. You know, Zoe, she began, her tone softening. Ethan and I have just been a little concerned. Concern. There's nothing to worry about, I said gently. I know, she said quickly. And you've done amazing on your own, truly, but sometimes things change. There it was. The shift, subtle, but intentional. What kind of things, I asked. She smiled. Just life, she said. It gets harder to manage everything alone as time goes on. We just want to make sure you're supported. Supported. I nodded slowly as if considering it. I appreciate that, I said. And I meant it. just not for the reason she thought, because every word she spoke now was evidence. She stayed for about 20 minutes, long enough to observe, long enough to reinforce the image she wanted. Then she left with the same polished smile she had arrived with. As soon as the door closed, I picked up my phone. I didn't call Margaret, not yet. Instead, I opened a small notebook I had started carrying with me, and I wrote everything down, the exact phrases, the tone, the timing, because details mattered now. Every piece of this mattered. 2 days later, Lucas called. "I hope I'm not overstepping," he said, "but I thought you should see something." We met at a quiet cafe near the restaurant. He arrived with his usual calm presence, but there was tension beneath it. "I've been reviewing some recent communications," he said, sliding his phone across the table. I looked down. A message thread. From Brittany to someone on his staff. She requested priority access to private dining rooms, Lucas explained. Said it wouldn't be an issue soon because her husband would have expanded authority over family investments tied to the property. My chest tightened slightly. Not from surprise, from confirmation. She's been very confident, Lucas added carefully. More than someone should be, without something already in place. I handed the phone back slowly. "Thank you," I said. He studied me for a moment. "You already knew, didn't you?" he asked. I suspected, I replied, and now I met his eyes. "Now I'm certain." He nodded once. "If there's anything I can do, you already have," I said gently, because he had. More than he probably realized. When I left the cafe, the world felt sharper, not heavier, clearer, because the picture was complete now. Brittany wasn't guessing. She was expecting. Ethan wasn't hesitating. He was preparing, and whatever they believed was coming. They were already acting as if it was inevitable. That night, Ethan came over. He brought the documents again. More organized this time, more polished. "Just so we can go through everything together," he said, setting them down on the table. I nodded, sitting across from him. He walked me through each section, slowly explaining things in simplified terms. Too simplified. "This just makes things easier for you," he said at one point. "It means I can handle things if anything ever becomes overwhelming." Overwhelming. "And this part?" I asked, pointing to a section Margaret had flagged. "That's just standard language," he replied quickly. "Nothing to worry about, nothing to worry about." I looked at him, really looked at him, at the confidence in his voice, at the ease with which he dismissed something so serious, at the way he believed I would accept it without question. And for a moment, I felt something unexpected. Not anger, not even betrayal, sadness, because he truly thought this was normal now, that this was how things were done, that this was what success looked like. "Okay," I said softly. He blinked. "Okay," he repeated. "I'll think about it," I added. Relief washed over his face so quickly he couldn't hide it. "Of course," he said, "take your time." But we both knew. Time wasn't what he wanted. As he gathered his things and prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "Mom," he said, turning back slightly, "this is really just about making things better for you. Better." I gave a small nod. "I know," I said, and as he walked away, I closed the door gently, then stood there for a long moment in the quiet, because everything was in place now. The words, the evidence, the intent. They believed they were guiding me towards something inevitable, something they had already decided. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't see, was that every step they took forward was leading them exactly where I needed them to be. The plan didn't feel like revenge. It felt like balance. Margaret made that clear the second I sat down across from her, again notebook in hand pages filled with dates, phrases, and moments that no longer seemed small. "You've done exactly what you needed to do," she said, flipping through my notes with quiet approval. "You stayed calm. You documented everything. And most importantly, you didn't alert them." I nodded, though my fingers tightened slightly in my lap. "They're getting more confident," I added. "Brittany especially. She's starting to act like it's already done." Margaret gave a faint knowing smile. "That's good," she said. I frowned slightly. "Good, yes," she replied, "because confidence makes people careless." She closed the notebook and set it aside. Now we moved to the next phase. There was something about the way she said it, precise, controlled, that steadied me. Not because it made things easier, but because it made things clear. "What do I need to do?" I asked. Margaret leaned forward slightly, her voice lowering, not out of secrecy but out of focus. "You're going to give them exactly what they think they're getting," she said. I held her gaze. "Meaning, you're going to agree to review the documents," she continued. "You're going to ask a few questions, reasonable ones, but not enough to raise suspicion. You're going to appear receptive." The word felt strange in my mouth, and then I asked, and then she said calmly, "We make sure that what they think they're signing isn't what actually protects them." A quiet understanding settled over me. "You've already prepared something else," I said. Margaret nodded. "A revised estate plan," she confirmed, "one that keeps full control in your hands with very specific safeguards." She slid a new folder across the desk. "This version ensures that no one, not even your son, can make financial or residential decisions on your behalf without independent oversight." I opened it slowly, scanning the pages. The language was clear, precise. Nothing hidden, nothing vague. "What about the house?" I asked. "It remains entirely yours," she said, "and any future transfer requires your direct authorization verified through a third party." I exhaled slowly. A piece of weight I hadn't fully acknowledged lifted, and the rest I asked. Margaret's expression softened slightly. "That's up to you," she said. I looked down at the document again, at everything it represented, not just protection, choice, freedom. And then I thought about Daniel, about the life we built, about the years we spent making sure Ethan would never have to struggle the way we did. And something inside me shifted, not away from love, but away from obligation. "I want to set something aside," I said quietly. Margaret tilted her head slightly. "For what a scholarship?" I replied. "In Daniel's name, for students who can't afford to stay in school." A small smile touched her lips. "I think he would have liked that," she said. I nodded. "I think so too." We spent the next hour going through every detail, every clause, every protection. Nothing rushed, nothing assumed, because this time, everything mattered. When I left her office, the folder in my hand felt heavier than the last one Ethan had given me, not because of what it took away, but because of what it secured. That afternoon, I called Ethan. "Hi, sweetheart," I said, keeping my voice warm, steady. "Hey, Mom," he replied quickly. "Everything okay?" "Yes," I said. "I've been thinking about the paperwork." A pause. I could almost hear him straighten. "Yeah," he asked. "I think it would be good for us to go over everything together," I continued. "Maybe with Brittany there, too." Another pause. Longer this time. "That sounds great," he said, a note of excitement slipping into his voice before he could hide it. "We can do it this weekend, if you want. That works for me," I replied. "And Mom," he added, "I think this is really the right step." "Right." I closed my eyes briefly, then opened them again. "I'm sure you do," I said softly. We agreed on Sunday. Brunch at my house, casual, comfortable, familiar, exactly the kind of setting where things felt safe, predictable, under control, for them. The next 2 days passed quietly, but underneath that quiet, everything was moving. I reviewed the documents again, not because I didn't trust Margaret, but because I needed to understand every word myself, every protection, every boundary, every line that ensured no one could ever put me in that position again. I also prepared something else, not legal, not strategic, just emotional, because I knew what was coming, not just the conversation, but what it would reveal and what it would confirm. Sunday arrived with a stillness I hadn't felt in a long time. Not calm, not exactly, but centered. I set the table the way I always did. Simple, clean, familiar, no performance, no pretense, just the life I had always lived. At exactly 10:30 a.m., they arrived. Brittany stepped in first, her smile bright, her posture confident. Ethan followed carrying a leather folder, the same one, or at least what they believed was the same one. "Smells amazing in here," Brittany said, glancing around. "Thank you," I replied. We sat, we ate, we talked, about nothing, about everything, the kind of conversation that fills space without meaning anything. And then, Ethan reached for the folder. "Whenever you're ready," he said. I wiped my hands slowly with a napkin, then nodded. "Let's take a look," I said. He opened it, sliding the documents toward me. I glanced down, recognized the formatting, the structure, but not the content, because what he thought he was presenting was no longer what would decide anything. Before we go through it, I said calmly, there are a few things I'd like to understand. Brittany leaned forward slightly. Of course, she said. That's exactly what we're here for. I met her gaze, and for the first time since all of this began, I didn't feel uncertain. I didn't feel hesitant. I didn't feel small. I felt ready. Because this wasn't about catching them off guard. It wasn't about humiliation. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about truth. And the moment that truth stepped fully into the room, there would be no going back. The room felt smaller once the papers were on the table. Not physically, but in the way everything narrowed focus, tightening air, growing heavier words, carrying more weight than before. Ethan sat across from me, his posture composed, but I could see the anticipation beneath it. Brittany leaned slightly toward him, her hand resting lightly on his arm, as if grounding him, or perhaps reminding him of the role he needed to play. I looked down at the documents, then back up at them. Let's start from the beginning, I said calmly. Ethan nodded quickly. Of course. He began explaining just like he had a few nights earlier. This first section is just about consolidating financial oversight, he said, tapping lightly on the page. It means I can help manage things if it ever becomes overwhelming for you. Overwhelming. The word didn't carry the same softness anymore. And what would qualify as overwhelming, I asked. Ethan paused. Just general difficulty, he said. You know, if things start to feel like too much. I tilted my head slightly. And who decides that? Another pause. Usually it's just a mutual understanding, he replied. Nothing formal, nothing formal. I nodded slowly, letting the silence stretch just long enough to be felt. Then I glanced down at another section, and this part I asked, pointing. Brittany leaned in before Ethan could respond. That's just to make things easier down the line, she said smoothly. So there's no confusion about property decisions. No confusion, I repeated. Yes, she said, smiling. It prevents complications later. I looked at her, really looked at her, at the confidence in her tone, at the ease with which she spoke about something that would fundamentally change my life. And if I disagree with a decision, I asked. Her smile flickered, just slightly. Well, she said carefully, that's unlikely since everything would be done in your best interest. There it was again. Best interest. A phrase that sounded protective, until you realized how easily it could be used against you. I turned my attention back to Ethan. And this section, I said, tapping lightly on the page Margaret had highlighted about living arrangements. Ethan shifted in his seat. That's just precautionary, he said. In case you ever need more support. What kind of support, I asked. Brittany answered again. The kind that ensures you're safe, she said. Comfortable. Taken care of. Taken care of. I felt something settle into place. Not anger, not yet. Just clarity. And where would that support take place, I asked. Ethan hesitated, then answered, well, if it ever came to that, we'd probably look at something smaller, easier to manage. Maybe a condo or a community where you'd have access to help. A condo, a community, a place where I would be moved, decided for, managed. I nodded slowly as if considering it. That sounds very organized, I said. Relief flickered across Brittany's face. Ethan exhaled quietly. Yes, he said. That's the goal. The goal. I folded my hands together on the table. And my house, I asked. Brittany smiled again. We'd handle that as part of the transition, she said. It's a valuable asset, and it makes sense to put it to better use. Better use. I held her gaze. And what would that be? She didn't hesitate this time. Selling it, she said simply. Reinvesting the value, making sure it works for the future. The future, not mine, theirs. Silence settled over the table. Not uncomfortable, but undeniable, because something had just been said out loud that could not be taken back. Ethan shifted again, glancing at Brittany briefly before looking at me. It's just about being practical, Mom, he said. We're thinking long-term, long-term. I leaned back slightly in my chair. And when exactly did you start thinking about all of this, I asked. The question caught him off guard. What do you mean, he asked. I mean, I said calmly, when did you decide that my life needed to be reorganized? Brittany's posture stiffened. That's not what this is, she said quickly. Then what is it, I asked. My voice didn't rise, didn't sharpen, but it held something new, something steady. Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it again. "It's just planning," he said finally. "Planning for what I asked." "For the future," Brittany answered, her tone tightening now. "We've already explained that." I nodded. "Yes," I said, "you have." I let a moment pass, then another, long enough for the weight of the conversation to settle fully into the room. And then I spoke again. "You've both put a lot of thought into this," I said. Ethan nodded. "We have," he replied. "And you believe this is what's best for me," I continued. "Of course," Brittany said quickly. I looked at her, then at Ethan. And for the first time since we sat down, I allowed the silence to stretch just a little longer than it should have. Because silence has a way of revealing things words try to hide. Ethan shifted again. Brittany's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the table. They were waiting for agreement, for acceptance, for the moment they believed was inevitable. I reached for the pen resting beside the documents, picked it up slowly, turned it once between my fingers, and in that moment I saw it clearly. Not just what they were asking, but what they expected. They expected me to trust them, to follow their lead, to sign without fully understanding, because that was who I had always been to them. The mother who didn't question, the woman who didn't push back, the one who made things easier. I placed the pen down gently. "I have a few more questions," I said. The shift was immediate, subtle, but unmistakable. Brittany's smile tightened again. Ethan's shoulders tensed. "Of course," he said carefully. I looked down at the documents once more, then back up. "This section here," I said, tapping lightly about decision-making authority. "Does it take effect immediately?" Ethan hesitated. "Technically, yes," he admitted, "but it's not something I would." "So you would have control," I said calmly. He paused, then nodded. "In certain situations, yes, I let that settle. And these situations," I continued, "would be determined by you." Another pause. "Yes," he said. The room felt even smaller now, tighter, because the truth was no longer hidden behind careful language. It was sitting right there, on the table, between us. And if I disagreed, I asked again. Brittany exhaled softly. "Zoe," she said, her tone shifting now, less polished, more strained, "we're trying to help you." I met her eyes. "I didn't ask for help," I said. Silence. Sharp this time. Ethan leaned forward slightly. "Mom, it's not about asking," he said. "It's about what's necessary." Necessary, the word echoed, because it wasn't a suggestion, it was a decision. One they believed had already been made. I sat there for a moment, letting everything settle into place. Every word, every assumption, every truth they had revealed without realizing it. And then I nodded. Slowly. Deliberately. "I understand," I said. Relief flooded Ethan's face. Brittany's posture relaxed, because they thought that meant agreement. But what it actually meant was something else entirely. Because now, I didn't just suspect what they were doing. I knew. And once you know something like that, you don't walk into it blindly. You walk into it prepared. After they left, the house felt too quiet. Not empty, just different. As if something that had been holding the space together had finally slipped away, leaving behind only what was real. I stood in the kitchen for a long time after the door closed. The documents were still on the table. The pen still rested beside them. Nothing had been signed, but everything had changed. Because there was no longer any doubt. No room for interpretation. No possibility that I had misunderstood. I cleaned up slowly. Not because it needed to be done, but because I needed the movement, the rhythm, something steady to hold on to while everything inside me settled. When I finally sat down, I didn't reach for the phone right away. I didn't call Margaret. I didn't write anything down. I just sat and thought about Ethan. Not the man who had sat across from me that morning, but the boy. The one who used to run into the house after school, dropping his backpack by the door, talking too fast about everything that had happened that day. The one who used to look at me like I had all the answers. The one who trusted me completely. I closed my eyes. Because that version of him felt very far away. When the knock came, I knew it was him before I even opened the door. There was something in the way he knocked. Familiar, careful. "Mom," he said when I opened it. He looked different now. Not physically, but in the way he held himself. Less certain, less composed. "Can I come in?" he asked. I stepped aside without speaking. He walked in, slowly glancing around as if the house might have changed in the few hours since he'd left. It hadn't. But something else had. "I just wanted to talk," he said. I nodded. "We can talk." We sat in the living room, not across from each other this time, side by side, like we used to. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he exhaled. "I think that got a little intense," he said. "A little." I almost smiled. "Did it?" I asked. He ran a hand through his hair. "I didn't mean for it to feel like pressure," he said. I want to make sure you're taken care of." Taken care of. The words didn't sting anymore. They just clarified. "I've been taking care of myself for a long time," I said. "I know," he replied quickly, "and you've done an amazing job. But things change, Mom. You can't do everything forever." There it was again. The quiet insistence. The assumption. I turned slightly to face him. "And when did you decide that?" I asked. He hesitated. I didn't decide anything, he said. I just see things. "What things?" I asked. He looked away. "For one," he said, "you shouldn't have to worry about money the way you do." I stilled. Because that was new. "What do you mean?" I asked. He exhaled. "I've noticed," he said. "You don't spend. You hold on to everything. You live like you're still struggling. I studied him. "And you think that's a problem?" I asked. "I think it's unnecessary," he replied. "You don't have to live like that anymore." I felt something shift inside me. Not sharply, but deeply. "I live the way I choose to," I said. He shook his head slightly. "That's what I mean," he said. "You choose to live small." The words landed harder than anything he had said that day. Not because they were cruel, but because they were honest, and honesty as a way of cutting deeper than intention. "Small," I repeated. He nodded. "I've worked hard to build something bigger," he said. "Something more stable, more respectable." Respectable. I held his gaze. "And I'm not?" I asked. "That's not what I said," he replied quickly. "It's what you meant," I said. Silence. Heavy this time. Because there was no easy way out of it. "I just think—" He started, then stopped. "Say it," I said quietly. He looked at me. Really looked at me. And for a moment, I saw something there. Not just frustration, not just defensiveness, something else. Something he had been holding back. "I used to be embarrassed," he said. The words hung in the air, sharp, unavoidable. I didn't move, didn't speak, because I needed to hear the rest. "When I was in school," he continued, his voice quieter now everyone else had more. "Better clothes, better homes, parents who looked like they belonged in the world I was trying to enter." He swallowed, and I didn't. I felt my chest tighten, not in anger, in recognition. "I worked hard to change that," he said, "to build something different, and now that I have, I don't want to go backward." "Backward?" I nodded slowly. "So you see me as backward?" I said. He hesitated, then, "Yes." The word didn't come easily, but it came, and once it did, everything settled, because that was it. That was the truth beneath everything else. Not just the documents, not just the plan, but the reason. He didn't just want control, he wanted distance, from the life we had lived, from the version of me that reminded him of it. "I didn't realize," I said quietly, "that everything I gave up for you would become something you wanted to erase." His expression shifted. "That's not fair," he said quickly. "I'm not erasing anything." "You already have," I replied. Silence. Not sharp this time. Just final, because there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to explain. "I'm trying to build something better," he said again. "And I'm not stopping you," I said. He frowned. "Then why does it feel like you are—" I looked at him, really looked at him, at the man he had become, at the distance that had grown between us, at the truth that now stood clearly where confusion used to be. "I'm not stopping you from building your life," I said. I paused, then added, "I'm just not giving you mine." The words settled between us, not loud, not dramatic, but immovable. Ethan leaned back slightly, his expression tightening. "So that's it?" he asked. "You don't trust me?" I held his gaze. "No," I said. The honesty of it surprised even me, but I didn't take it back, because it was true, and truth doesn't need to be softened to be real. He nodded slowly, as if something inside him had just confirmed what he already suspected. "Okay," he said. Just that. Then he stood. Not angrily, not dramatically, just quietly. "I guess I know where we stand," he added. I didn't stop him, didn't ask him to stay, because this wasn't something that could be fixed in one conversation, or 2, or 10. This was something deeper, something that had been building for years, and now it had finally surfaced. He walked to the door, paused for a moment, then opened it. "Good night, Mom," he said. "Good night, Ethan," I replied, and then he was gone. The door closed softly behind him, and for a long time I just stood there, not broken, not even surprised, just clear. Because sometimes the hardest part of a situation isn't discovering the truth. It's accepting what that truth means. And now that I had, there was only one thing left to do: move forward, without pretending anything was still the same. 3 days later, Brittany made her move. It didn't come as a confrontation. It came as concern. That morning, I was watering the small plants on my kitchen windowsill when the phone rang. I recognized the number immediately. It wasn't Ethan's. "Hello," I answered. "Good morning, Mrs. Harper," a calm professional voice said. "This is Dr. Alan Pierce from Lakeside Wellness Services. I'm calling to schedule a brief cognitive and safety assessment." I didn't react, didn't interrupt. An assessment I repeated evenly. "Yes," he said. "We received a request expressing concern about your well-being. It's a standard procedure, nothing to worry about." Concern. There it was. "And who made this request?" I asked. There was a brief pause. "I'm not authorized to disclose that information," he replied carefully. "Of course he wasn't, I see," I said. "And what exactly does this assessment involve?" "Just a few questions," he explained. "A general evaluation of memory, decision-making, and living conditions. It helps ensure that individuals are safe and capable of managing independently." Safe, capable, independent. Every word lined up perfectly with everything I had been hearing. "I understand," I said calmly. "And when were you hoping to schedule this?" "As soon as possible," he replied. "We have availability this afternoon or tomorrow morning." "Quick, too quick. I'll take tomorrow morning," I said. "Excellent," he replied. "We'll send confirmation shortly." The call ended. I stood there for a moment, the quiet of the kitchen settling around me. Then I set the watering can down and reached for my phone. Margaret answered on the second ring. "They've escalated," I said. Her voice sharpened immediately. "What happened?" I explained the call, the wording, the timing, the urgency. When I finished, there was no hesitation in her response. "Good," she said. I blinked. "Good, yes," she repeated, "because now they've crossed from planning into action." Something about the way she said it steadied me. "They're trying to establish a record," she continued. "Something they can point to later if they need to justify further control." I assumed as much, I said, which is why she added, "We're going to meet them there." There. Not avoid it, not delay it. Face it. "I want you to attend the assessment," she said, "but not alone." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "You'll be there," I said. "Of course," she replied. The next morning, everything was ready. Not just emotionally, legally. Margaret had already prepared documentation, my recent medical records, cognitive evaluations, financial statements, everything that clearly demonstrated what we already knew. I wasn't confused. I wasn't incapable. And I certainly wasn't someone who needed to be managed. At exactly 10:00 a.m., Dr. Pierce arrived. He was polite, professional, carried himself with the kind of calm that suggested he had done this many times before. "Mrs. Harper," he said with a courteous nod as he stepped inside, "thank you for agreeing to this." "Of course," I replied. Margaret stood beside me. Margaret Blake, she introduced herself. "I'll be present during the assessment." Dr. Pierce's expression shifted slightly. Not discomfort, awareness. "I understand," he said. We sat in the living room, the same place Ethan and I had spoken just days before, but this time, the balance was different. Dr. Pierce began with simple questions, names, dates, recent events. I answered each one clearly, without hesitation, without confusion. Margaret said nothing. She didn't need to. Her presence alone changed the dynamic. After about 15 minutes, Dr. Pierce shifted slightly in his chair. "Everything appears to be in order," he said. "I'm glad to hear that," Margaret replied calmly. He nodded. "However," he added, "there was also a concern raised about your living situation." I met his gaze. "What kind of concern?" I asked. "That you might benefit from additional support," he said, carefully, "to ensure safety and consistency." I almost smiled. I manage my home without difficulty, I said, and we have documentation to support that. Margaret added, sliding a folder across the table. Dr. Pierce opened it, reviewed the contents, and as he did, I saw it. That shift again. Recognition, understanding. When he looked up, his tone had changed. Subtly, but definitively. I see no indication that additional oversight is necessary, he said. Margaret nodded once. Thank you, she replied. He closed the folder and stood. I'll be submitting my report this afternoon, he added. It will reflect my findings accurately. I appreciate that, I said. He gave a polite nod, then left. The door closed behind him, and for a moment, the house was completely still. Then Margaret turned to me. Well done, she said. I exhaled slowly, not in relief, in release, because something had just shifted, not just legally, but emotionally. They really thought this would work, I said. Margaret didn't soften her response. They hoped it would, she corrected. A difference, but an important one. What happens now, I asked. Now, she said, we let the consequences settle. It didn't take long. That afternoon, Ethan called. His tone wasn't calm this time. Mom, he said, I just got a call about the assessment. I assumed you would? I replied, a pause. Then, why didn't you tell me, he asked. Tell you what I said, that someone was coming, he said, that there was an evaluation. I let the silence sit for a moment, then answered. You didn't tell me either, I said. The line went quiet, not empty, just heavy. That's not the same, he said finally. Isn't it? I asked. He exhaled sharply. We were trying to help, he said. By questioning my ability to live in my own home, I replied. That's not, he started, then stopped. Because it was, and he knew it. We were concerned, he said instead. Concern doesn't look like that, I said. Another pause. Longer this time. Then Brittany thought it would be a good idea, he said. There it was. The shift, the distancing, the attempt to redirect responsibility. I see, I said. But I agreed, he added quickly. So it's not just her. No, it wasn't. And for the first time, he wasn't pretending it was. I appreciate your honesty, I said. He didn't respond immediately. Because honesty has a way of changing conversations. We just wanted to make sure everything was secure, he said finally. Everything is secure, I replied, and I meant it, more than he understood. Mom, he started, but I didn't let him finish. No, I said gently. We're not having this conversation right now. Silence. Then okay, he said quietly. Not agreement, not acceptance, just recognition that something had changed. After the call ended, I sat down slowly. Not because I was tired, but because I felt it. That shift, that undeniable turning point. Because they hadn't just failed. They had revealed themselves. Completely. And now? There was no version of this story left where I could pretend I didn't know exactly who they were. The invitation I sent wasn't dramatic. No long message, no explanation, just a simple line. Dinner. Friday evening, same restaurant, private room. Ethan responded within minutes. Is everything okay? I stared at the message for a moment before replying. Yes, I'd like us to talk. He didn't ask anything else. Brittany didn't respond at all, but I knew she had seen it. Because 2 days later, they both arrived. Early. That alone told me everything I needed to know. They thought this was reconciliation, an apology maybe, or better yet, a reversal. A moment where I would step back into the role they understood, the one that made things easier for them. Lucas met me at the entrance. Everything is prepared, he said quietly. I nodded. Thank you. The private room was exactly as I remembered. Soft lighting, polished wood, a long table that made every conversation feel more formal than it was. But this time, I chose my seat carefully. Not at the end. Not at the edge, but in the center, where no one could pretend I didn't belong. Ethan and Brittany walked in together. Brittany wore another carefully chosen dress, elegant, understated, but unmistakably expensive. Ethan looked more subdued, less confident, but still composed. Mom, he said, offering a small, tentative smile. Zoe Brittany added her tone, warm to warm. Thank you for coming, I said. We sat. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was waiting for someone to define what this dinner meant. Brittany broke first. I'm really glad we're doing this, she said. I think it's important that we clear the air. Clear the air. I nodded slightly. I agree, I said. Ethan leaned forward. Mom, about the other day, he began. I raised a hand gently. Before we get into that, I said there are a few things I need to say. They both stilled, not defensive, but alert, because something in my tone had shifted, not louder, not harsher, just certain. I've spent the last few days thinking I continued, not just about what happened, but about what it means. I let the words settle. Then I looked at Ethan. "You asked me why I didn't tell you about the restaurant," I said. He nodded slightly. "Yes. The truth is, I said I didn't think it mattered." Brittany's eyes flickered. Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" he asked. I continued calmly, I didn't believe my value came from what I owned. Silence. But I see now I added that it mattered to you. Ethan shifted. It is, I said gently. And this time? He didn't interrupt, because he couldn't. Not without lying. I turned my attention to Brittany. "You built a story," I said, "about who we are, about where Ethan came from." Her smile faltered. "I didn't—" "You did," I said, still calm, still steady. "But that's not the part that concerns me," I added. Now she was completely still, because she could feel it. We had moved past misunderstanding, past denial, into something else, something final. "What concerns me," I said, "is what you tried to do next." Ethan's posture changed, not dramatically, but enough. "Mom," he started. "No," I said quietly. "You've both had time to speak. Now it's mine." He closed his mouth, and for the first time, listened. I reached into my bag and placed a folder on the table. Not the one he had brought to my house. A different one, Margaret's. "This," I said, "is my updated estate plan." Brittany's breath caught just slightly. Ethan leaned forward. "What is this?" he asked. "It's the version that protects me," I replied. Silence. Sharp. Immediate. Because now they understood. Not everything, but enough. "I've removed any provision that gives you control over my finances." I continued looking at Ethan. "Or my property." His expression tightened. "Mom, and I've added safeguards," I went on, "that prevent anyone from making decisions about where I live or how I live without independent oversight." Brittany leaned back slightly, her composure slipping. "This is a misunderstanding," she said quickly. "We were trying to help." "You were trying to take control," I said. Not loudly, not angrily, just clearly. Ethan exhaled sharply. "That's not fair," he said. "Isn't it?" I asked. He didn't answer, because he couldn't. Not without confronting the truth he had already admitted. I let the silence settle. Then I continued. "I've also made another decision," I said. They both looked at me, waiting. I held their gaze. "I've established a scholarship fund," I said, "in Daniel's name." Ethan blinked. "What, for students who can't afford to stay in school?" I explained. Brittany's eyes widened. "And the funding for that," I added, "comes from the assets you were planning to restructure." There it was. The shift. Not subtle, not quiet, immediate. You gave it away. Brittany asked, her voice sharper now. "I invested it," I corrected, "in something that matters." Ethan leaned back in his chair, his face pale. "You didn't even talk to me," he said. I looked at him. Really looked at him. "You didn't talk to me either," I replied. Silence heavy, because now there was no room left for anything else. Lucas stepped into the room then, not abruptly, not dramatically, just present. "As always," he said calmly, "Mrs. Harper's arrangements here remain under her direction." His words weren't for me. They were for them, a confirmation, a reminder of who I was, of what they had misunderstood. Brittany looked at him, then back at me. And for the first time since I had known her, she didn't look confident, she looked uncertain. Ethan didn't speak, didn't move. He just sat there, processing, realizing, understanding, because this wasn't a negotiation. It wasn't a conversation. It was a conclusion, and I had already reached it. "I'm not here to punish you," I said finally, my voice softer now, but no less steady. "I'm here to be clear." I stood, not abruptly, not dramatically, just finished. "You wanted to build something better," I said, looking at Ethan. "I hope you do." I paused, then added, "But you'll build it without taking anything from me." The words settled. Final. Complete. And as I turned to leave the room, I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel angry. I felt free. The silence that followed that dinner lasted longer than I expected. Not days, weeks. Ethan didn't call. Brittany didn't text. And for the first time in a very long time, No one asked me for anything. At first it felt strange, not painful, just unfamiliar, because I had spent so many years being needed, being the one who filled gaps, solved problems, softened tensions that the absence of that role left a quiet space behind. But slowly, that space began to feel like something else. Not emptiness, peace. My days changed in small ways. I started waking up without immediately checking my phone. I took longer walks through my neighborhood, noticing things I hadn't paid attention to before, the way sunlight shifted through the trees in the afternoon, the quiet rhythm of people going about their lives without needing to perform for anyone. I spent more time at the foundation meetings Margaret had helped me set up. At first, I attended quietly, listening more than speaking, but over time, I found myself sharing. Not just ideas, experience, stories. Because I wasn't the only one. There were other women, some older, some younger, who had found themselves in similar positions. Trusted, relied on, and then slowly edged out of decisions that once belonged to them. I thought I was helping, one woman said during a meeting, her voice unsteady. I didn't realize I was giving everything away. I understood that, more than I wanted to admit. Another woman nodded. They made it sound like it was for my own good. That too. The language, the framing, the way concern can be shaped into control if you're not paying attention. And as I sat there listening, speaking when it felt right, I realized something important. What had happened to me wasn't just personal. It was a pattern. And patterns don't break unless someone names them. So I did. Not dramatically, not publicly, but clearly. And with each conversation, each meeting, each quiet moment of honesty, I felt something inside me strengthen, not harden, not close off, just stand. Stand in a way I hadn't before. Meanwhile, life moved forward for Ethan and Brittany. I heard things, not directly, but through the same quiet channels information tends to travel. Their plans had stalled. The property Brittany's brother had been waiting to sell never materialized. Financial pressure started to show, not in obvious ways, but in small ones, changes in tone, in timing, in the way certain opportunities suddenly became urgent. And when people build something on expectation rather than reality, that kind of pressure has a way of exposing cracks. They've been arguing, Margaret mentioned one afternoon, almost in passing. We were reviewing some paperwork at her office. I didn't look up right away about what I asked. She shrugged slightly. From what I've heard about who miscalculated what, I nodded slowly, not surprised, because when a plan fails, it rarely fails quietly, and it rarely fails alone. Weeks passed. Then one afternoon, as I was finishing a late lunch, there was a knock at the door. I knew who it was before I opened it. Ethan stood there, alone. No Brittany. That alone told me everything I needed to know. "Hi," he said. He looked different. Not just tired, not just stressed. Quieter, less certain. "Hi," I replied. We stood there for a moment, neither of us rushing to fill the silence. Then he spoke. "Can I come in?" I stepped aside. Of course. He walked in slowly, glancing around the house in a way that felt almost unfamiliar, as if he was seeing it for the first time, or maybe as if he was realizing what it actually meant. We sat in the living room again, the same place as before, but nothing about it felt the same. "I've been thinking," he said after a moment. I nodded. "I assumed you had." He let out a small breath. "I didn't understand," he said. "I didn't respond, because I needed to hear what he meant. Not fully," he added. "I thought I did. I thought I was being practical, responsible. The word echoed differently now, but I see it now," he said. "The way we approached it, the way I approached it." He trailed off, searching. Not for an excuse, for clarity. "It wasn't right," he said finally. No defense, no deflection, just that. I looked at him, at the way he held himself, at the absence of certainty that had once defined him, and for the first time since everything had unfolded, I saw something familiar. Not the boy he used to be, but something closer to it. "I appreciate you saying that," I replied. He nodded. "I don't expect anything to change," he added quickly. "I know I crossed a line. I thought about that. Because what had happened wasn't just a line, it was a shift, a redefinition. But still, he had named it, and that mattered. I'm not here to ask for anything," he continued. Needed to say that. Silence settled between us, not heavy, not strained, just present. And for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like something that needed to be fixed. "I'm glad you came," I said. He looked up, surprised. "Yeah," he asked. "Yes," I replied, because I was. Not because it erased anything, not because it repaired everything, but because it meant something had changed, even if only slightly. We sat there for a while longer, talking, not about the documents, not about the past, just talking. And when he finally stood to leave, he hesitated at the door. "I'm still figuring things out," he said. "I know," I replied. He nodded, then added, "I'm trying to do better." I held his gaze. "That's all anyone can do," I said. He gave a small, quiet nod, then left. The door closed softly behind him. And as I stood there, I realized something that surprised me. I didn't feel closure. Not completely, but I also didn't feel the same weight I had carried before. Because healing isn't about everything going back to the way it was. It's about learning how to move forward without needing it to. 3 months later, I stood in front of the same restaurant, the same doors, the same polished glass reflecting the evening light. But this time, I didn't hesitate before walking in. The air inside felt familiar, but not in the way it had that first night. Back then, I had entered carrying uncertainty, aware of how I might be seen, how I might be judged. Tonight, I carried none of that. Lucas greeted me near the entrance, his expression warm but respectful as always. "Good evening, Mrs. Harper," he said. "Good evening, Lucas," I replied. "Everything is ready," he added. "They've already started gathering." I nodded. "Thank you." The event was being held in the main dining hall this time, not hidden in a private room, not tucked away behind closed doors. Open, visible, exactly the way I wanted it. The scholarship event had grown more than I expected in just a few months. What began as a quiet idea had become something real. Students' families, donors, people who understood what it meant to need a second chance and not have the means to take it. I paused for a moment before stepping fully into the room. Not out of hesitation, out of awareness, because I knew what this place represented, not just the night I had been mocked, but the moment everything had shifted, and I wanted to feel that contrast, to recognize it, before moving forward. Then I walked in. The room was alive with conversation gentler than the kind Brittany had curated, less performative, more grounded. People weren't there to be seen. They were there to support something. That difference mattered. "Mrs. Harper," someone called softly. I turned to see one of the scholarship recipients, a young woman with bright eyes and a posture that carried both gratitude and determination. "Thank you for being here," she said. "Thank you for your work," I replied, because that's what it was. Work, effort, not performance, not image, something real. I moved through the room, slowly greeting people, listening, connecting in a way that felt natural, not forced. And then I saw him. Ethan stood near the back of the room, not at the center, not positioned to be noticed, just there, watching. He wore a simple suit, nothing flashy, nothing that tried to draw attention. When our eyes met, he didn't look away, but he didn't step forward either. He waited, and that alone told me something had changed. I made my way toward him, not quickly, not slowly, just steadily. "Hi," he said when I reached him. "Hi," I replied. For a moment we stood there, the noise of the room softening around us. "I wasn't sure if I should come," he said. "But you did," I replied. He nodded. "I wanted to see this," he said, gesturing slightly toward the room. "What you built." I followed his gaze, at the students, at the conversations, at something that had grown from a decision I had made for myself and for others. "It's not just me," I said. "A lot of people made this possible." He smiled faintly. "You started it," he said. I didn't argue, because this time, it wasn't about minimizing anything. It was about acknowledging it honestly. I heard about the scholarship, he added, about what it's doing. I nodded. "It matters," I said. He looked down briefly, then back up. "I understand that now," he said. There was no hesitation in his voice, no uncertainty, just clarity, and that mattered more than any apology he could have given. I'm glad I replied. We stood in silence for a moment, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It wasn't strained. It was neutral, balanced, and for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. Brittany didn't come, he said after a moment. I didn't react. Didn't ask why, because I didn't need to. Some things don't require explanation. I figured, I said simply. He nodded. She's still processing things, he added. Processing. I let the word pass, because whatever Brittany was working through was no longer something I needed to carry. That's her journey, I said. Ethan looked at me, studied me, and I could see it in his expression, the realization. Not just of what had happened, but of what had changed. In me, in us. I know I can't fix everything, he said quietly. I held his gaze. No, I replied. Honest, clear, not harsh, just real. But I want to keep showing up, he added, if that's okay. There it was. Not a request for forgiveness, not an expectation, just an intention, and that was different. I considered his words for a moment, not because I didn't know the answer, but because I wanted to give it the weight it deserved. You can show up, I said. Relief flickered across his face. Subtle, but there. But understand something, I added. He straightened slightly. I'm not going back to the way things were, I said. I know, he replied quickly. I mean it, I continued. Not just the decisions, the dynamic. He nodded. I understand. And this time, I believed him. Because understanding isn't something you say. It's something you carry. And I could see it now. In the way he stood, in the way he listened, in the way he didn't try to take up more space than he had earned. Good, I said. A soft announcement began near the front of the room. The event was starting. I glanced toward the stage, then back at him. I have to go, I said. Of course, he replied. I turned to leave, then paused. Not because I needed to, because I chose to. I'm glad you came, I said. He smiled, not broadly, not confidently, just genuinely. Me too, he replied. And then I walked forward, toward the stage, toward the people waiting, toward something that belonged entirely to me. As I stood there looking out at the room, I felt it fully for the first time. Not pride, not victory. Something quieter, something steadier. Self-respect. Because the dress I wore that night, simple, elegant, chosen by me, was never the point. It never had been. The point was this moment, standing in a room where I didn't need to prove anything, where I didn't need to shrink, where I didn't need to explain my worth, because I already knew it, and that was something no one could ever take from me again. There's a quiet kind of pain that comes from being underestimated, especially by the people you've given the most to. It doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes in small moments, a glance that lingers too long, a word that feels just slightly off a silence, where there should have been support. And for many of us, especially women who have spent a lifetime caring for others, it's easy to explain those moments away. We tell ourselves they didn't mean it. We tell ourselves love is enough. We tell ourselves that sacrifice is part of the role. But here's the truth. I had to learn the hard way love should never require you to disappear. Kindness should never be mistaken for weakness, and support should never come with conditions that take away your voice, your choices, or your dignity. What I went through wasn't just about money. It wasn't about a house. It wasn't even about betrayal. It was about boundaries. About understanding that no matter how much you've given, no one has the right to decide your life for you. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do isn't to fight loudly. It's to stand quietly, clearly, and say, no more. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What would you have done in my place? Do you believe family relationships can truly heal after something like this? Leave a comment and share your perspective. And if you enjoy stories that explore real emotions, difficult choices, and personal strength, don't forget to like and subscribe. Also, tell me, where are you watching from and what time is it there right now? You're not alone in your story, and your voice matters.